Hi, everyone. My name is Adrianna Stephenson, and it's a pleasure to be here today talking to you. I am a brain tumor parent, a ketogenic diet advocate, a real food crusader, and a big picture thinker, and this is our story. The title of my talk today is Therapeutic Ketosis and Pediatric Brain Tumors, Parker's Incredible Journey. Simply put, this is the story of how we saved my oldest son, Parker, after he was diagnosed with a large brain tumor when he was only 19 months old. Please keep in mind that I am not a doctor, a scientist, or a registered dietitian. I am a mom on a mission to share our journey with the goal of helping others. Our hero's journey starts out on November 24th, 2014, when Robert Parker Stephen was born at the auspicious time of 11 p.m. He was born at 41 weeks, a solid 8 pounds, 14 ounces via emergency C-section. And despite the difficult 30-hour labor, his APGAR score was perfect. He nursed easily, and we considered ourselves the luckiest of parents. Parker was a gregarious baby, and during his first year of life, he met his developmental milestones on time. He crawled for the first time on his 6-month birthday and was pulling up to cruise by 7 months. But he didn't start to walk independently until he was 14 months old, and this bothered me. Here's a video of Parker taking some of his first steps, which lacked the body confidence I'd come to expect from him. By the time Parker was 16 months old, I began to notice a persistent left-handed dominance. My husband, who is left-handed, figured it was because he was going to be a lefty like Dad. But my instinct told me it was something more. What? I couldn't say, but it became a persistent underlying worry. His walking was still very wobbly. He would sway while standing still, and he preferred to kick toys to move them rather than to pick them up. Here's the video of him from that time demonstrating some of the symptoms we saw. But still, these changes in him were subtle and developed over the course of several months. But perhaps most concerning of all was when he started fisting his right hand, holding it tight to his body. And I'll never forget the moment during an evening bath when I noticed that his right hand couldn't grasp the toy that was submerged in water. The warning bells in my head would not be silenced. And at Parker's 18-month well baby visit, I forcefully voiced our concern with our pediatrician. We were referred to a neurologist, and a few weeks later, Parker was scheduled for a neurological assessment. After the exam was completed, the doctor told us that while Parker looked great, the right hand and its lack of fine motor control was abnormal. But what could it be? Our neurologist requested an MRI to rule out anything more serious, and we left that appointment believing it could be something as simple as a pinched nerve. On July 25th, 2016, within an hour of finishing his MRI, our neurologist called us at home and simply said, "I know why Parker is having difficulty with his right hand." And this was the image she was looking at. It would be several frantic days before we saw this MRI image, as we scrambled to make sense of what this meant for our baby and to find a pediatric neurosurgeon who would take our case. But we had an answer to all of the months of niggling worry and unease. We didn't know what was to come, and we were living hour by hour in uncharted territory. I'll never forget the first time I saw these images. They took my breath away, and my first thought was, holy expletive. It seemed impossibly large and impossibly lodged in the middle of his brain, and I wondered how on earth you survived something like that. And in case you aren't familiar with MRIs, That giant white circle in each of these cross sections is the brain tumor. It measured roughly 4 centimeters in diameter, so about the size of a golf ball, in the brain of a 19-month-old baby. Our neurosurgeon, Dr. David Sacco in Dallas, spent hours with us going over the radiology report and brainstorming possible options. We began to make sense of what we were seeing. The tumor was in a very central part of the brain, and there was a possibility that his optic nerve and pituitary gland were damaged. There was also significant pressure on his third ventricle and mass effect on the midbrain, which suggested that he was at great risk for hydrocephalus and/or a stroke. The tumor was also highly vascular and had lit up like the 4th of July when they administered gadolinium, which is the contrast dye used during an MRI. As I pored over the radiology report after our initial consultation, there was one line that haunted my thoughts: malignant neoplasm of the central nervous system. This so-called low-grade tumor seemed like a much larger beast than any of us could have imagined. Over the next 10 days, as Dr. Sacco met with the Dallas Tumor Board and mapped out his surgery route, I devoured any and all information I could find on JPA tumors. Tumor pathology would be confirmed after the surgery, but early signs pointed to a pilocytic astrocytoma, which is a type of glioma and is generally classified as slow growing. The hypothalamus is a small but crucial region of the brain near the pituitary gland, whose roles include releasing hormones, regulating body temperature, controlling appetite, and regulating emotional response, among other things. On the morning of August 11th, 2016, we kissed Parker goodbye and waited an excruciating 8 hours for Dr. Sacco to perform brain surgery, not knowing whether or not our son would wake up, and if he did, whether he'd be the same child. As you can see from this video of Parker playing before being admitted to surgery, his right side had deteriorated significantly in the weeks since the initial neurological assessment, with the right hand frozen in a permanent clawed position. But the stars aligned that day, and the surgery was a success. Dr. Sacco was able to remove about 70 to 80% of the tumor by going in through the top of the head, navigating in between the 2 lobes of the brain, traversing a ventricle, and then removing the majority of the tumor from the inside out. We were incredibly fortunate that there was no new neurological damage, and he was released from the hospital after less than a week. For the next 3.5 months, we were on watch and wait, waiting to see how the tumor would respond to surgery. He seemed to have recovered well, and we didn't see any new cause for concern. A week after his 2nd birthday, Parker went in for his MRI, and we were cautiously optimistic. Unfortunately, we discovered that the residual tumor was not only growing, but that the resection cavity had also increased in size, and there was a new cystic area. Additional surgery was off the table, and we suddenly found ourselves on the oncology floor of the hospital, meeting with a new team of doctors and trying to absorb this sudden change of events. Within days, we had agreed to start a chemotherapy treatment plan in which Parker would receive 3 chemotherapy drugs, carboplatin, vincristine, and temozolomide, over the course of 18 months. Here are a brief overview of some of the documented side effects of these drugs, which include hearing loss, life-threatening systemic hypersensitivity, neuropathy, central neurotoxicity, and perhaps most frightening of all, the risk of developing secondary cancers like leukemia. At first glance, the treatment efficacy statistics were encouraging, with about 50% of the children achieving stable disease, which frankly was what we hoped for. However, upon closer review, the statistics were much less encouraging. Surgery had confirmed that Parker's tumor originated in the hypothalamus, which seemed to greatly hamper his progression-free survival. As I took a closer dive into the efficacy of the chemotherapy, I found that there were 4 major prognostic factors at play when looking at the long-term survival rates of children with JPA tumors, those being age at diagnosis, feasibility, radical reaction, tumor location, and exposure to radiation therapy. So let's tackle each one of those prognostic factors. The first being age at diagnosis. Young age at diagnosis is a known risk factor and translates to an inferior overall survival rate. And I'll remind you that Parker was only 19 months old at diagnosis. Excuse me. And I also wanted to point out that a 2018 study showed that about 70% of children with infant hypothalamic chiasmatic glioma progress, meaning that their tumor grows during chemotherapy. The second prognostic factor is the feasibility of radical resection. The reason so many pediatric neurosurgeons are hesitant to operate on tumors like Parker's is because it can often cause additional harm, such as impaired neurological and endocrine function. And actually, I later found out that about 50% of pediatric neurosurgeons will not operate in and around the hypothalamus or that thalamic region. Our surgeon, Dr. Sacco, is one of the few who is not afraid to approach that area. Whereas the majority of pilocytic astrocytomas are classified as grade 1 or the least aggressive type of tumor, I was shocked to learn that metastatic disease is 23 times more likely to develop in children with JPAs in the hypothalamic region. And lastly, exposure to radiation therapy. Thankfully, Parker was too young for radiation therapy and would actually need to fail several different chemotherapy protocols. In retrospect, I'm incredibly grateful that radiation was off limits upon diagnosis, knowing now what I know about the devastating side effects and the risk factor for delayed mortality for survivors of pediatric low-grade gliomas. So in short, Parker had many factors working against him as he started chemo. And when I asked our medical team what we could do to support Parker during chemotherapy, if there were any foods we should avoid or any diets we should consider, I was told that no food was off limits and to let him be a kid. The intense induction phase of the chemotherapy protocol lasted about 10 weeks, and we waited with bated breath to see how he was responding to treatment. And we had successfully tapped the brakes on tumor growth. Although tumor growth was temporarily halted, I became increasingly aware that we were in for a marathon of a fight. And as I looked to the future, I saw years of chemotherapy, serious health risks, developmental delays, and looming heartbreak. It was terrifying, exhausting, and I felt stripped of all control over my child's future. That was a turning point for me. And in early spring 2017, 3 events coincided that changed the trajectory of our journey. I could speak for hours on the significance of each of these events, and it's challenging to squeeze everything into this brief overview. The first thing that happened was, upon suggestion from a friend, I read Travis Christofferson's book, Tripping Over the Truth. It's an incredible read that explores the origins of the metabolic theory of cancer. This book demystified cancer, and it lit a fire in me to fully understand the mechanisms behind tumor development. It gave me a foundation to start exploring keto as an adjunctive therapy to chemotherapy. Delving deep into the science was a welcome return to self for me too. In my pre-brain tumor parent life, I was an academic librarian at a large university in Texas. And while the study of 16th century Italian drawings has little to do with understanding tumor cell biology, I knew how to research, to find primary sources, and to categorize information. It was empowering, and it was the first step of putting myself back in the driver's seat of Parker's treatment. The second thing that happened was that I connected with a woman whose daughter had the same exact tumor as Parker. Same location, same outward manifestation, same surgery. She placed her daughter on a strict ketogenic diet during chemotherapy, and at the end of treatment, her daughter's tumor was gone. This mother's willingness to reach out to a stranger with open arms, encouraging, answering questions, and sharing practical tips changed my life. She's the reason I tell people I found out about keto from another mom, not my medical team. And the third thing that happened was that I connected with Max Love Project. This nonprofit not only provided me with a supportive community of childhood cancer parents, but they also gave me an invaluable evidence-based research resources to share with Parker's oncologists regarding the ketogenic diet. As I dove headfirst into research on ketogenic diets and cancer, I came across a lot of criticism with regards to kids and keto. A keto diet was said to be inconvenient, difficult to implement, nutritionally deficient, and painfully restrictive. Nutritionists painted it as unnecessarily cruel and obsessively controlling. If you've ever thought these things about a ketogenic diet, especially in regards to children, I'd ask you to shift your perspective for a moment. Let's contextualize inconvenience. Losing your hearing, suffering from irreversible painful neuropathy, or developing secondary cancer when you are a toddler, that seems unnecessarily cruel. Having your hair fall out, being too weak to play with toys, and relentless vomiting, that's beyond difficult for children. The animal crackers, cookies, apple juice, and ginger ale on endless offer during chemo seems the epitome of nutritional deficiency. How can dietary changes be more inconvenient than these documented horrors? And so I jumped in with both feet, and I never looked back. When I started Parker on a strict ketogenic diet, I did not keep it secret from our oncologists, but nor did I ask permission. However, I did provide them with a 10-page annotated bibliography of research highlighting metabolic approaches to cancer. This was one of the many gifts that Max Love Project gave to me. Here are some of the evidence-based benefits of a ketogenic diet for cancer. Of particular interest to me was that it had the potential to sensitize Parker's tumor to chemotherapy, as well as slow growth. I was also very interested in the neuroprotective qualities of the diet, given my concerns over his development. And as you can see here, these are just some of the incredible benefits that it has. So what did a therapeutic ketogenic diet look like for us at the beginning? Well, first, it involved daily and often multiple times a day blood testing. For me, this was a non-negotiable tool that provided invaluable metabolic information. We had to know how food was affecting him. Secondly, I focused on nutrient-dense foods like pastured eggs, full-fat dairy, grass-fed butter and meat, and low-sugar vegetables and fruits. Thirdly, I kept it simple and offered foods on repeat that he liked. Meals like cream cheese pancakes, cheese shell tacos, cauliflower rice, and avocado were always on offer. And that spring, from April until his next MRI in June, I put every ounce of energy of keeping Parker in deep levels of ketosis while he received 2 more maintenance rounds of chemotherapy. And that next MRI showed that we were on the right track. The news was better than I expected. The tumor was 30% smaller. Amazingly, all the post-surgical edema had resolved, and our neurosurgeon truly could not believe that. And the cystic portion that had developed in the post-surgery period was almost gone. That was really big news for us because the cyst's growth was synergistically tied to the active tumor. And before I go on, I do want to take just a moment to talk about BRAF genetic testing and why it matters, or genetic testing on these tumors and why it matters. During this time, I insisted on getting his tumor tested from the tumor sample tissues that they had from his surgery. We found out that his tumor had the KIAA 1549B fusion gene. This is incredibly valuable information because there are some mutations, like the aggressive V600E BRAF mutation, that may not respond to a ketogenic diet. This information also opens the door to new MEK inhibitor drugs that are currently in clinical trials. And because low-grade gliomas are notoriously resistant to chemotherapy, it's really crucial to have a variety of treatment options for these children. But to go back, we never from that moment on looked back. We powered on with a therapeutic ketogenic diet while he continued chemo. And this two images here show us 11 months of chemo plus 7 months of a strict ketogenic diet. On this next date, November 16th, 2017, his MRI took a stunning turn. We read the words on the radiology report that said, essentially completely resolved, which means almost completely gone. What a difference a year makes. You can tell by Dr. Sacco's face, he can't quite believe it either. In 1 year, we went from an actively growing and changing tumor with dangerous intracranial pressure to a small resection area with only faint enhancements. And every single subsequent MRI got better and better. Here's the image from 4 months post-chemo and 16 months of a ketogenic diet. And we did in fact finish all 18 months of his chemo protocol. And here's Parker's scan from last June. He has been considered NED, or no evidence of disease, that's what that acronym stands for, since December 2018. And he actually just had his annual scan a few days ago, and I'm thrilled to share that he remains NED with no evidence of recurrent tumor activity or abnormal enhancement. I'm still stunned to see how far he's come in 3.5 years. That's Dr. Sacco showing Parker his scans from last summer and him saying, "That's in my brain." This is a dramatic before and after. And for us, this incredible reality was the result of a trifecta of interventions, each piece playing a critical role and all playing off one another. This is what I call our magic formula. It was surgery plus chemo plus a ketogenic diet. I just want to go back to those prognostic factors I mentioned at the very beginning of treatment, because somehow Parker's incredible healing had upended every prognostic factor that worked against him at the beginning. His young age, the location in the hypothalamus, the residual tumor. We weren't able to get the entire tumor resected, and thankfully no radiation therapy. And somehow, miraculously, he was one of the 4% of children that demonstrated a complete response during chemotherapy, despite those prognostic factors. So why did it work? Why did our trifecta of interventions work? What was the key to our success? Was he just that lucky? What I believe we witnessed was the press-pulse theory at work. In simplistic terms, we used diet to press or stress the tumor cells by restricting glucose, and then pulsed them in their weakened state with the trio of chemotherapy drugs. I also believe the timing was crucial. that we used a ketogenic diet as a frontline intervention, not as a last-ditch effort to save him after failed multiple protocols and relapses, which unfortunately is when many families turn to dietary intervention. Studies have also shown the neuroprotective qualities of ketone bodies and the anti-inflammatory nature of the diet, both of which I believe contributed to the support of Parker's brain and the resolution of that post-surgical edema. And ultimately, there was a synergistic relationship between all three interventions that I could probably spend a lifetime exploring and still not fully understand. So what is adjunctive therapy? For us, adjunctive therapy was combining a therapeutic ketogenic diet alongside standard of care. It was surgery plus chemo plus keto. For other families, adjunctive therapy often includes hyperbaric oxygen, acupuncture, cannabis, and other complementary interventions. As an adjunctive therapy, a ketogenic diet was a complete lifestyle shift that required a consistent daily commitment from our family and from our medical team. It meant that when Parker was admitted to the hospital for a serious port line infection, a ketogenic diet was written into his orders by our oncologist. It meant that when he was in the clinic for chemotherapy infusions, he was given fluids without added glucose. And we also meant that we brought our own keto snacks from home. If you've ever done a Whole30, you'll be familiar with this quote, and it's true. Changing the way you think about food is hard, and shifting to a ketogenic diet requires a leap of faith for most people. But I want to circle back to this diagram because it shows the powerful disconnect between what society tells us are acceptable levels of risk and what interventions are just considered too much work. Let's tackle each of these criticisms of a ketogenic diet. The first, that it's inconvenient. Well, we haven't found it to be that inconvenient. Burrito bowls, crustless pizzas, bunless burgers, Starbucks drive-through, we can find a keto option at almost any restaurant. And if you've never had a Flying Dutchman from In-N-Out Burger, then you haven't lived. The second keto criticism for kids, that it's nutritionally deficient. And I want to remind everybody that ketosis is a metabolic state, not a prescribed list of foods. From the beginning, I've focused on nutrient-dense foods, and the majority of our meals look like this. Emphasis on pastured eggs, meat and full-fat dairy, fatty fish at least once a week, organic vegetables, low-sugar fruit, and fat sources like avocado, coconut, seeds, and nuts. And these are all pictures these are real-life pictures of our food that we eat and that we've been eating for almost 4 years. Another criticism of keto for kids is that it's difficult for children. And ultimately, this is where your attitude as a parent comes into play. It's as difficult as you make it, and children will soak up everything that you say. Personally, I've tried to treat it as a culinary adventure from day one. And while it isn't always easy, there are many worse things than ditching the bread, like losing your toddler to a brain tumor. People also say that a ketogenic diet for children is incredibly restrictive. I've also gotten comments that I'm not letting my kids be kids. And again, here's where I urge people to shift their perspective. Celebrating my son's 5th birthday with a homemade keto cake did not feel restrictive. It felt like a milestone celebration that I wasn't sure I'd see 3.5 years ago. Making cheese shell tacos, that's a fun and delicious way to get my kids to help in the kitchen, not an inconvenience. And making build your own pizza bowls on a Friday night is a new tradition my whole family enjoys. To sum it up, this is what keto looks like for our family. It involved routine blood testing, whole family commitment, and an emphasis on real food. Our secret to long-term success has been having fun in the kitchen, finding new and creative ways to offer certain foods and setting new traditions. And importantly, the food we eat tastes great. If you haven't found that out, fat makes food taste really good. It's not a punishment to eat this way. And that's something that I want to reiterate over and over to my children. It's not a punishment to eat this way. We are nourishing our brains and our bodies. When I started Parker on a ketogenic diet almost 3 years ago, one of my biggest concerns was giving him a complex about food. I intentionally worked hard to make keto a lifestyle change for our entire family, and I've found that our celebrations are just as meaningful without sugar. And this is how I describe the ketogenic diet for our family. It is learning to have celebrations, making empowered food choices when we're not at home, and educating my kids on what foods feed their brain and their bodies, which food makes them feel good. I felt powerless when Parker was first diagnosed. I had absolutely no control over his future. I was told there was nothing more I could do to support him at home except to let him enjoy his childhood as much as you can during chemotherapy, and to pray for the best, despite the odds. But what if we flipped the script and encouraged families instead? What if as a society, we reiterated that a happy childhood is more than sugar? What if we presented a ketogenic diet as a sustainable, safe lifestyle? What would happen if we started talking about food as medicine? Did you know that more than 28,000 children in the United States are living with the primary diagnosis of a brain tumor? Did you know that there are more than 100 different types of pediatric brain tumors, and that this makes diagnosis and treatment incredibly difficult? Did you know that more children die of brain tumors than any other form of cancer? And did you know that survivors of childhood brain cancer often suffer lifelong side effects caused by their illness, as well as by treatments such as surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation? I didn't know those statistics either until my child was one of those numbers. Ultimately, this is why adjunctive therapy matters. Less than 4% of the National Cancer Institute's research budget goes towards all childhood cancer. And you can see what a low priority those 100 different types of pediatric brain tumors get. Ultimately, this is why I share our journey so publicly. Children like Parker and so many others don't have the luxury of time to wait for the perfect research study. The unpleasant truth is that there is no money to be made in childhood cancer. It's not a funding priority. And that is why adjunctive therapy, like a ketogenic diet, is so critical. But as my friends at Max Love Project like to remind us, statistics are not destiny. Food matters.